Hi, I'm Sumit Bose. Welcome to the Net Hero podcast. If you've not listened, where have you been? Come on, get involved. We talk about all things energy, sustainability, and of course, net zero. We're here to talk about business and what it can do to make the planet better. We're here to talk about science. We're here to talk about you. So if you'd like to be involved, then do drop us a line, listen in, tell your friends, tell your business partners, subscribe, and for all your news around net zero, follow us on futurenetzero.com. Now, on to this week's episode. Hi, on this week's episode, air. Oh yes, and I'm not talking about the album from 2002. I'm talking about the air we breathe. How clean is it? How clean should it be? There's an element of the whole net zero transition that's actually quite fundamental. It's part of what the SDGs are, the Sustainable Development Goals. Giving us cleaner air to breathe is one of the most important things. But have we done enough to do so? Obviously, if you live in London, ULEZ has come in, the dreaded ULEZ, the hated ULEZ by many people. There are other schemes in other parts of the UK and also around the world looking at trying to reduce air pollution. The recent Cricket World Cup was held in India, and one of the big issues there was the smog. Same in Beijing, if you remember, or Brazil. Globally, air pollution is one of those things that kind of sits in a funny place. Is it health, or is it kind of really the responsibility of the energy sector to clean up their act? Is it about traffic emissions? Well, we're going to explore all of that and what should be done with Imogen Martineau from the Clean Air Fund this week. Imogen, hello.
Hello, great to be here.
What is the Clean Air Fund?
So the Clean Air Fund is a global philanthropy that was set up in 2019 to accelerate action on air pollution worldwide. But we also work in a number of specific geographies, which other people call countries.
Yeah.
So those include the UK, which I'm head of, and also India, Bulgaria, Poland, Ghana. We do quite a lot of work with the EU, and we are soon opening an office in South Africa. But essentially, we were established to crowd more funding into the air pollution space, because as you mentioned, it was slightly falling between the stools of climate change and health. And there was a kind of recognition by a group of philanthropists that air pollution was really impacting the health of all people, particularly people living in urban areas, particularly in the global south, and particularly vulnerable people, so children and the elderly. So action on air pollution delivers benefits to climate, but also to health. So it's a win-win.
What is the fund doing? So what do you fund?
That's a very good question. So one of the challenges that we face on air pollution is quite low levels of public awareness. There are some areas where public awareness is really high and air pollution is very visible. So in some Indian cities and some cities in China, it's something that everyone is talking about because they experience.
Of course, you can see it. Yeah. When I go and visit my relatives in Calcutta, you can taste it in the air.
Exactly. And that's what we had in the UK with the smog, which brought about the kind of first Clean Air Act. But there's also air pollution that isn't visible. And so a lot of the work that we do is about raising awareness of the health impacts of air pollution in order to build public demand for politicians really to take action on the issue. So a lot of our work is around awareness raising, demand raising, working with campaigners and community groups to really kind of keep air pollution on the agenda as an issue that needs to be tackled. And the great thing about air pollution is there are solutions. It's relatively easy to fix. It just needs the political will.
Do you find any science? So obviously people may have seen, if you drive around, you look carefully, you can see these funny little stations that are dotted around roads, and they're little kind of monitoring stations for pollution. Do you fund any of that stuff, or is it all just about kind of raising awareness, what you do?
We do some monitoring, some projects to do with monitoring. We don't fund kind of large scale academic research because the budgets involved are just beyond us. But we have done some schemes. We did a project in London called Breathe London, where we put up low-cost sensors to see whether we could track, use low-cost sensors really to kind of mirror and replicate the data that was being gathered from the government's official monitors. And that allowed us to gather data from areas where information wasn't currently being sourced. So then we just get insights into kind of particular hotspots where air pollution is really bad, and that can inform and drive policy solutions.
It's funny, I'm quite old. So when I was growing up, pollution was the word, right? There wasn't any climate change. People talked about pollution. And pollution was very tangible. You could see it, You chuck some crap into a river, fish die. You can see that. Factories produce smoke and smog. People understand that. Do you think that the whole issue of why something like your organization needs to exist is because the whole narrative has changed, particularly over the last 10 years, to this kind of climate change and this amorphous thing of, 1.5 degrees and things like that, which most humans find very difficult to contemplate the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And most humans find it very difficult to contemplate a ton of CO2, whereas they can see a polluted river and they can see, smog. Why do you think the whole, issue led to this, your group being funded? Because clearly we've known about this for years, and you said the solution's pretty simple, but kind of not really happened, has it?
I think you're absolutely spot on your analysis. And essentially we're, very, very highly evolved animals, and we respond to our senses. So if this kind of ceiling fell in right now, in your studio or my home, we would rush out of the sphere of danger.
You know a lot about the builder who put our ceiling together.
Exactly.
You're not bad.
You move pretty fast. And so we are basically evolved to respond to things that we experience with our senses. And as you say, for a lot of people, climate change, I think it's changing fast, because I think people are much more conscious of seeing and feeling and experiencing climate change and its impacts. But I think for a long time, it had been a kind of a cognitive, intellectual concept shown in graphs and charts and reports. I think one of the benefits of talking about air pollution is that it allows the conversation to focus on your local area, on health, on how emissions of greenhouse gases can, whether they're from vehicles or from houses or from local industry, how they're impacting your local community. So it really brings it home, it really localizes it, and it allows people to really understand how it's impacting them and their communities now. But the other thing that we're seeing in talking about air pollution is that the ways of tackling air pollution also deliver significant benefits to your local community. So we've got a campaign running called Refresh Britain, which is very much focused on, if you deliver these policies, which are around improving streets, improving homes, improving your local towns, they deliver benefits to the community in terms of better public transport, more reliable public transport, greener parks, better space, access to spaces. And so those benefits, the kind of win-wins, are the things that people really appreciate and want to see. So air pollution allows us to change the conversation a bit from this kind of climate change, which I think can often feel so huge, and sometimes it's happening more over there than over here. And it allows us to really localize some of the issues and bring them home to people, quite literally.
I want to talk about globally as well, because obviously your organization looks around the world, but let's stick to the UK for now. ULEZ, right? Ultra low emission zone. Very, very controversial and quite hated by a lot of people who live in outer London. Now, there's a current spat going on about an advert that's, talked about the effect of the low emission zone, ULEZ, initially, and how it sort of helped cut the number and levels of pollution in central London. The problem, I think, for most people is they don't see that punishing them is the way to resolve this. And they don't see the fairness where someone owns a 40-year-old Rolls-Royce 3.2 litre diesel engine, and yet if you own a 10-year-old diesel Golf, you're paying, but they're not. Can you see why a lot of people have not just continued to dislike ULEZ, but actually question its significance in reducing air pollution? Because actually, if you want to do that, you really should say, right, ban these cars or put certain restrictions on all exhausts, and that will clean things up. You're basically using it as a money-making scheme, many people say.
I can't speak for the mayor's office, and that's really not my
No, I get it. But your organisation backs something like ULEZ. You think it's a good idea, don't you?
We think that low emission zones have a really important part to play in reducing levels of nitrogen dioxide, and they have been proven to be the fastest way of bringing down concentrations of nitrogen dioxide, which were at illegal levels in large parts of the UK. So the British government was mandated to really take drastic action on combating those concentration levels. The ULEZ scheme itself it's got its supporters, it's got its opponents.
Of course.
I totally understand the challenges. I think efforts have been made to support people with the transition to a lower emission transport system, so the scrappage scheme, improvements in public transport. But I accept that for certain individuals,
Yes.
it is, having a significant impact, and during a cost of living crisis, that is going to be experienced more than ever.
And that's the hard thing, isn't it? Because I don't think anyone would disagree, let's cut pollution. But it's the instruments that, you talk about policy, awareness and driving policy that makes the difference. It's very tricky for politicians to get that right, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point also about how policies are designed and introduced. So the Refresh Britain campaign that I referenced earlier, we've developed a suite of policies that are based on in-depth audience insights. So we've talked to focus groups up and down the country to understand their concerns, their kind of attitudes to air pollution, and the solutions that they'd like to see. And a lot of it is about as I was mentioning earlier, about the kind of improvements in their local community that also deliver improvements in air quality. So I think what people struggle with is where policies are mandated and have an impact on the individual. And I think those are always going to be more challenging policies to introduce. I think it'll be interesting to see. We don't have data yet on the ULEZ expansion and its impact on air pollution. I think that will be interesting to see. And I think also with a lot of policies, you do see a lot of concern before policies are introduced. I think there was a lot of misinformation about the number of people that were going to be affected by the ULEZ scheme. And so it's going to be interesting to see, over the coming year, how public attitudes to that change, and what the impact is on air pollution. And obviously we've got a mayoral election coming back, and that will be the real
I think that'll be a litmus test. Yeah. The problem is for this, and you talk about the whole idea of making sure generally the poorer are more disproportionately affected by things like air pollution, because they live in areas that are generally more urban. They live in areas where there are big roads with cars and buses and diesel and all of that. And yet also with the ULEZ, they generally drive the poorer, older cars that suffer. I'll park the ULEZ thing for now. Good pun there, parking it. But in terms of that, with people who are more at the sharp end of this, tragically, we had the little girl who died a couple of years ago, and that was all, related to air pollution. It doesn't matter what we seem to do. We've had congestion charges for 20 years. Still, levels of pollution in big cities like London, Birmingham, you go to Manchester, are really, really high. So are we missing a trick in terms of getting things such as public transport cleaner or freight cleaner before we look at the cars? What do you guys look at in terms of, you say it can be done. You said earlier on, it's quite an easy thing to do. Well, what should we be doing? Because it's still not working.
I mean, there have been significant improvements in air quality over the last, several decades. So we have seen a reduction in levels of particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide. They're still higher than they ought to be. They're higher than the World Health Organization would recommend that they were, but we have seen improvements. The challenge is that those improvements are kind of now plateauing. So that's why we're very keen to kind of keep the pressure on and make sure that we see a continuation of that overall trend. But you're absolutely right that air pollution sort of ties in with a lot of other societal inequalities and contributes to those growing health inequalities. And that's something that we're very, very conscious in the way that we look at policy design and implementation.
People say EVs, they're the panacea. They're not really, because there's lots of pollution that comes up from their tires, but they're definitely far more visible because nothing's coming out and the crap's coming out the exhaust. You can see it. Where do you sit on the transport transition? as an
I
organisation?
think EVs have a part to play. As you
Yeah,
say, they do also contribute to air pollution through particulate matter. So through brake and tyre wear, they actually contribute to PM 2.5. But as you say, they reduce emissions of nitrogen dioxide. I think in terms of a sort of a good solution for transport, what we need is a better public transport system that is more
right.
reliable,
Yeah,
that is cleaner, that is more efficient. So a lot of the reason that we're seeing people getting into their cars, particularly in the last few years, is because public transport isn't reliable. There are a lot of people who are forced into their cars because they don't have another option.
very true.
And so what we'd like to see is a better solution for those people so that they don't have to get in their cars, they don't have to sit in traffic jams, and they don't have to find expensive parking spaces, and they don't have to be polluting the air around their towns and cities. Instead, they can hop on a bus or a tube or a tram and get to work or wherever they're going in a way that's kind of clean, reliable, and they know when they're going to get there. I think that's absolutely crucial, and that's been a real challenge in the last years.
Is this really just a problem of cities? Because people would say, well, if you go outside London, public transport's pretty poor, okay? But then again, the populations are less. So if you go out into a kind of village on the outskirts of Cambridgeshire, people will be using their cars, definitely, because that's the only way they can get around, because there is no infrastructure. But then the pollution is a lot less because there's less cars. So where do you sit on this? Because some would say, well, actually, just tackle the cities, hence ULEZ here and perhaps in Birmingham and other places, and all the big sort of conurbations. But there is pollution that affects everyone in this country.
There is pollution that affects everyone. And I mean, it's worse in cities because you have more transport,
Yeah.
more business, you have a high density of population. But there are rural areas that suffer significant levels of air pollution, where particularly where they in rural areas which might have an incineration unit, for example, or specific industrial kind of operations.
Big industrial process, yeah.
Exactly, that impact the local community. So it's not just an urban issue, but it is more pinpointed in the rural communities. But in terms of the access to public transport, I mean, ideally you would have good public transport, wherever you are in the country. And I think there's a big role for tech also in this, of finding better solutions, bringing people together, whether that's through car sharing or on-demand buses. But there are solutions out there. It's about providing the funding to ensure that those are made available and accessible to everyone.
You've been going since 2019. What do you think you've achieved?
Gosh, in the UK or worldwide?
Let's start with the UK for now.
In the UK, I think we've done a lot to support organisations across the health and environmental movement to really make clear the need for stronger action on air pollution. So there was a new Environment Act that was brought into place by the government, and we campaigned hard for the target for particulate matter. And sorry, this is really geeky.
No, it's important, yeah.
We achieved that target is now set at 10 micrograms per cubic metre. We lobbied for it to be achieved by 2030, and the government has set a target of it to be achieved by 2040, which we were disappointed with because we provided the evidence that target can be achieved by 2030. There really is no reason why it can't be.
And how do you see it being achieved? Are you talking about electrification, or are you talking about trying to clean up the heat that we have in our buildings? How do you see that target being achieved?
Well, what was interesting about the report that we commissioned from Imperial College is it shows that target, but the WHO 10 target, could be achieved by 2030 with existing government policies. So we're actually asking the government to commit to achieving a target which the data suggests is already going to be achieved across 99% of the country by 2030. And that will be achieved through things like the phase out of ICE vehicles. This research was done before the slight change, change, and changes in emissions from industry. So a lot of it is changes that as part of the kind of net zero work we're already seeing. But that's why we really want to keep the pressure up to make sure that those net zero transitions also really take account of air pollution as well, because there's a risk that some policies designed to deliver net zero could actually inadvertently contribute to air pollution. So we just need to make sure that the two are considered together. But we've made really good progress also in seeing the introduction of clean air zones where they have been introduced really well and effectively. So Birmingham City Council, Bradford, they've introduced clean air zones that have been really well done, well communicated, and there's been a dramatic reduction in air pollution as a result of those schemes. So we're seeing some really good measures. We're also seeing an increase in public awareness as a result of a lot more media coverage of the issue. A storyline going out on Coronation Street that was set up by Asthma Along UK. So we're just seeing more public discourse about it, and also the amazing campaigning done by Rosamond Adukisi-Deborah, the mother of Ella, who you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
And she does amazing work to really make sure that the issue is kind of front and center of the minds of politicians in London, the UK, and worldwide.
Before we go, let's talk about your worldwide action. I started by talking about India, which is where my family's from, and the smog that's there. Brazil, India, China, Russia, Philippines, doesn't matter where you go, Maldives, you can see the pollution in these places. Is what you're doing, and I hate to put this to you, but is it really kind of something for modern Western society that's already a lot cleaner than these places? Because it seems to me that you're facing an enormous challenge in these areas, and very little seems to have progressed.
I mean, I agree. It is a real challenge, and I agree it is not for Western society or governments to tell other parts of the world how to manage. I think that some of the work that we do is about working with the charitable sector and governments in those countries to work together to look at really actually what I was saying earlier about that net zero piece. As the world decarbonizes, and it's something that all governments around the world are looking to do.
Yes.
How can you make sure that that transition to a low carbon future, a zero carbon future, delivers health improvements at the same time? And so it's about engaging with health ministers at the same time as you're engaging with environment and climate change ministers, and making sure that you achieve sort of bang for buck. It's just bringing together, it's a bit of sort of joined up thinking. But how that's done is going to be different in every geography. There isn't a kind of one size fits all. And we've very much found that with all the work that we've done, is that there isn't a kind of silver bullet to the issue of air pollution. Different countries have different sources of air pollution. Generally, fossil fuels are the kind of main source. So there is a kind of, one major source, but how you tackle that is going to be done differently in different geographies.
Are you doing things? Are you doing campaigns in places like you said, I think Ghana, in Poland, India?
And working very much with different stakeholder groups in those areas, and working within the kind of art of what is possible in different geographies.
What's the public, sorry to interrupt, but what's the public perception there? Because obviously we've got a whole history of environmentalism in this country, and people are, God, I don't want this, whatever. What's been the thing? Because I think, again, I can only speak from family. People just sort of accept this is always the way it's been. If you live in Delhi, you've accepted that, it's been like this for 30 years. So they kind of just go, well, get on with it, put a mask on. Same in Beijing. Do you see anything that's showing you the public want to say, hang on a second, I've had enough?
Yeah, we've done some polling in quite a few of the countries where we work, and there are very high levels of public concern. It's translating that into action that is the challenge, and making sure that the policy solutions are acceptable to the populations that are experiencing the worst effects of air pollution. So I do think there is a desire to see change. I think it's just hard for an individual to see where that change comes from. But I think if we can work, I mean, it's about, it's not us as the Clean Air Fund, it's about the organizations that we work with, coming up with the kind of appropriate policy solutions and rolling them out and showing that they can work, and then scaling them up with support maybe from government. But there is also, one of the things that we've done quite a bit of work on in India as well as in the UK is also looking at the economic costs of air pollution.
Yes.
And they cost the economy a lot in terms of lost productivity of workers being off work because they are ill, or their loved ones are ill and they're taking care of them, or in worst cases they've died early. And the economic cost in the UK is £1.6 billion per year of us not having air quality in line with the WHO guidelines. And in India, I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but it was a huge figure.
I bet.
So there is an incentive for governments to invest now, a small amount now, to deliver improvements in air quality, which will both increase productivity, but also reduce the health burden on health services. So there is a kind of, there's a really strong rationale from the perspective of economics, from the health perspective, and also from just the improvement in the local area. And so a lot of our work is just designed to ensure that there's that incentive for politicians to take the action that's needed.
What are your hopes for the short term? What are your plans? Is it more campaigns? Do you start to see perhaps these low emission zones being more common around not just this country, but what are you wanting to do? If I'll give you an unlimited pot right now of cash. There you go, from my wallet. Off you go, Imogen.
You.
There you go.
That's really kind of you.
Don't go spending it all in IKEA for your new furniture. But if you're going to go and do it, what are you going to see? What do you want to see in the next couple of years?
In the UK, I'd like to see much more ambitious targets aligned to the World Health Organization.
So policy, you want to see policy changes that are
I'd like to see policy changes, and I'd like to see more funding for local authorities and local government to develop solutions to air pollution in their areas. And worldwide, again, a kind of bigger, stronger ambition in integrating improvements in air quality along with net zero plans based on the World Health Organization guidelines, and a real race for leadership on improving air quality. And so air quality being a bigger part of the conversations at things like the COP climate negotiations, which are taking place next month.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know what, it's one of those things where, as I said right at the beginning, it is a very tangible thing, you know, and it's one of those things perhaps we've taken a lot for granted. It's only when you go and see other parts of the world you realize how lucky we are. Imogen, thank you so much for joining us today. Really enjoyed it. If people want to find out a bit more or get involved in any campaigns, is there any way of doing that?
They can go to the website, which is cleanairfund.com.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, Imogen, thanks for that. If you would like to know more, go to the website, have a look. What's your thoughts on these clean air zones? Let me know. You can subscribe to the email. You can let us know on social media. My thanks to Imogen for joining us on this week's podcast. See you soon, and make sure you subscribe.
You've been listening to the Net Hero podcast with Sumit Bose from Future Net Zero. Visit our platform for all things net zero. And if you or your business is doing great things on the path to net zero and want to be featured on the podcast, email nethero@futurenetzero.com. Follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.